The dining room was warm with candlelight when I placed the folder on the table. Margaret had arranged 12 white poinsettias down the center. One for every year she had considered herself the center of this family. A crystal bowl of mulled cider sat between them. The Christmas music she had selected played softly from the sound system she purchased with money she should not have had access to, though she did not know that I knew that yet. She was mid-toast when the folder landed. "To family," Margaret said, wine glass raised above the candles. "The foundation of everything 89 pages, navy blue cover, the words Financial Forensicus in clean black type. Below that, my mother's name. Below that, the total, 287,000. Margaret's glass stayed in the air for 3 full seconds. Renee, seated across the table, new earrings catching the candlelight, looked at the cover first, then at me, then back at her mother. Her expression moved through the stages I had spent 26 years learning to read: initial assessment, rapid recalibration, and then the particular stillness that arrives when someone understands a situation has changed faster than their explanation can cover it. My father sat at the end of the table. He looked at the folder. He looked at me. I said nothing. The Christmas music played on, and in the silence between Margaret's unfinished toast and whatever came next, I thought about a specific Tuesday morning 18 years earlier. My mother at her kitchen table in rural Virginia, drinking coffee from a mug she had bought at a naval museum in Annapolis, working through the household accounts on a yellow legal pad with the same systematic patience she applied to everything in her life. Numbers never made her anxious. They made her calm. Because my mother understood some things that took me decades to fully absorb. Numbers do not have loyalties. They do not protect anyone's preferred story. They simply say what happened. She passed that habit to me. Not through instruction, through proximity, through the image of her at that table, in that quiet, with that mug and that pad. That mug was in my kitchen in Virginia tonight. I had poured coffee from it at 5 this morning, before beginning the 3-hour drive. But to understand how I got here, I need to go back to the beginning. My name is Diana Calloway. I am 54 years old. I live on 11 acres in rural Virginia, on a property I bought because the price was right, and the land reminded me of somewhere I could not name, until I realized it simply looked like quiet. I grow tomatoes in summer that I give mostly to neighbors. I have 2 dogs who have never been properly trained, and a truck with 190,000 miles that I intend to drive until it refuses to start. I retired from the United States Army 3 years ago after 26 years of service, most of it in logistics and intelligence support. The work that does not appear in recruiting videos, supply chain architecture, asset tracking, movement analysis across active environments. The discipline that, when it fails, does not produce missed deadlines, it produces casualties. I understood early that a number out of place is not an accounting error. It is a warning. And warnings ignored have consequences that are not abstract. I came back from my last deployment with a compressed disc in my lower back that has never fully resolved. On cold or wet days, I move more carefully than I used to. I mention this not for sympathy, but because it is simply true, and truth is the organizing principle of everything I do. After retirement, I took a position as a civilian logistics consultant for a mid-sized defense contractor. Reasonable hours, decent pay. I eat breakfast most mornings at the kitchen table, where 14 months ago I built the evidence that would change my family permanently. I said nothing when the trust accounts first stopped matching. I was counting. People who spend careers in military logistics develop a particular sensitivity to discrepancy that does not switch off when the uniform comes off. A figure that should be consistent and isn't. An account that shouldn't exist and does. A timestamp that contradicts the stated sequence of events. These are not anomalies. They are data. And data, in my experience, does not fabricate itself. Only people do. There is one thing I want to be clear about before this story goes any further. I am not a person who acts on emotion. This is not a boast. In circumstances, it is a limitation. But in this one, it was the only reason any of what follows was possible. Because what Margaret and Renee built their confidence on, the assumption that I would not look, or that if I looked I would not act, was built on a misreading of my silence. They mistook patience for ignorance. They mistook restraint for passivity. They were, as my mother would have said, bad with numbers. My mother, Ruth Calloway, was a meticulous woman in the way that people become meticulous when they have watched someone they loved lose something preventable. Her own parents lost their home in 1962 to a predatory lending arrangement that should never have been signed, and that no one had read closely enough. Before signing, she was 12 years old. She never forgot it. By the time I was born, she had established a household budget detailed enough to account for quarterly fluctuations in grocery prices. She maintained 3 separate savings accounts for 3 distinct purposes. She reviewed every bank statement the week it arrived, and filed every receipt in folders organized by category and year. She did this at the kitchen table, on a yellow legal pad, every Tuesday morning, numbers moving from column to column in her careful handwriting, while coffee cooled in the Annapolis mug she'd bought at a naval museum the year before I was born. She did not do this anxiously. She did it the way a pilot does a pre-flight check, not because she feared disaster, but because she understood that the difference between a preventable problem and an unpreventable one was usually a document someone hadn't bothered to read. She was also warm, funny, and deeply loved. I want to say that clearly because the qualities that eventually protected her estate were not cold ones. She was precise because she cared about stability, about her family's future, about not repeating a story that had already cost too much. She passed the habit to me without instructions. I absorbed it the way children absorb what they see repeated and respected. My father, Robert, was a different kind of person. A good man with a profound capacity for emotional loyalty and a corresponding preference for not examining things that made him uncomfortable. He trusted my mother to manage the finances because she was better at it, and because in 28 years of marriage, she never gave him reason to doubt. After she died, he was simply too lost to think clearly about the practical questions her absence created. He met Margaret 16 months after my mother passed. She was organized and cheerful and brought food to the house without being asked. She helped him with appointments he had been missing. She laughed at his stories about the Navy history documentary series he watched on repeat. She was, on every visible surface, exactly what a widowed man at 67 needs when he has run out of architecture for being alone. My father married her in December 2016. 9 months after meeting her, Renee was Margaret's daughter from her first marriage, 38 years old, articulate, pleasantly competent. She worked in residential real estate and had a particular talent for understanding how property structures worked, who held title, what a trust document could authorize, where the seams in an estate plan were wide enough to become a problem if you knew where to press. She had been looking for seams like that her whole career. My mother's revocable living trust had been established in 2009 with Harold Stearns, the family attorney for 30 years, as the administrator. Upon her death, the trust was to transfer entirely to me after a 5-year administrative period, during which my father could draw on income, but not the principal. Total trust value at the time of her death in 2014, $312,000. Real estate equity, retirement savings, and 40 years of careful accumulation. Harold Stearns retired in late 2019. The trust transferred to his associate, a younger attorney named Davis, who had begun his practice the same year I deployed to Kandahar. Davis had managed a property transaction for Renee the previous year. On February 14, 2020, at 9:42 in the morning Eastern Standard Time, the first transfer left my mother's trust. $8,400 administrative processing fee. My flight to Bagram had departed at 6:15 a.m. They had waited until I was in the air. What followed was not dramatic. This is one of the truths about financial crime that rarely appears in news coverage. The most effective versions are not dramatic at all. They are methodical, patient, conducted in amounts small enough to read individually as plausible, accumulating across time into something that only becomes visible when you add the full column. Thou's administrative fee, February 2020. $12,750. Trust restructuring, February 2020. $9,300 legal document preparation, March 2020. $15,000. Investment advisory consultation, billed to an LLC with no operational history, $6,200. Property assessment, $14. $500. Asset protection filing. The LLC was registered in Renee's maiden name on a secondary filing. A clerical error, never corrected, because they did not expect anyone to run the search. 48 transactions, 4 years. Every extraction cluster timed. I would discover this later, at 1:23 in the morning with cold coffee, to correspond precisely with the periods which I was deployed and unreachable. February 2020. November 2021, within 72 hours of my father's hospitalization. March 2022, during a 6-week communications restricted assignment. They were not just stealing, they were scheduling. While they were scheduling, the money moved, and the money spent. The LLC billed $15,000 in October 2021 for investment advisory services that produced no deliverable, no contract, no record of any meeting. That same month, Renee posted photographs from a coastal vacation. Cabo San Lucas, 4 days. Captions about deserving rest. Was in Romania coordinating a logistics review for 300 personnel on a 48-hour operational cycle. The LLC billed $14,500 in March 2022 for an asset protection filing that I would later confirm was never submitted to any court. Renee shared photographs of new kitchen appliances that spring, stainless steel, high-end brand. She tagged the location as home. I said nothing. I was counting. Not yet. That would come later. But somewhere in the operational discipline that 26 years of military service builds into a person, a habit was already forming. The habit of watching what the numbers said while everyone else watched what the people said. Total $287. Out of a trust that had held $312,000. When I returned from my final deployment in August 2022 and initiated the trust distribution process, 5-year period had passed, the assets should have been transferable. I found an account balance of $24,847. I sat with that number for a long time. Then I made coffee, opened a spreadsheet, and started counting. Not anger, not grief, counting. Have you ever done everything right, saved carefully, planned ahead, trusted the people responsible for protecting what your family built, and come home to find that someone else had been spending it while you were gone? Tell me in the comments below. I want to know where you're watching from. And if you believe that silence should never be confused with ignorance, subscribe to the channel. New stories premiere every single day. Before I opened the laptop that night, I stood in the back doorway for a few minutes looking at the field behind the house. September in Virginia has a particular quality of darkness. Not absolute, not the adjusted dark of cities, but the kind that actually settles on things and stays there. The dogs were somewhere in the grass. I could hear them moving but not see them. The fields smelled like the end of summer, dry grass, something cooling in the soil, the last of the season letting go. I went back inside at 1:23 in the morning on a Wednesday in September 2022. I sat at the kitchen table with a cold cup of coffee and my mother's Annapolis mug sitting empty. At the corner, a habit I had inherited without knowing exactly when, and opened the trust account export. The screen showed the transaction log in its standard format: date, amount, authorization, destination. I exported it to a spreadsheet. I sorted by date. I built a secondary column for modification timestamps, the dates when authorization paperwork had been finalized by the administrator's office. In legitimate estate administration, creation timestamps and modification timestamps are close. A document prepared and processed travels a predictable path through a predictable time frame. The modification timestamps in my mother's trust were not distributed predictably. They clustered. 3 distinct peaks: February and March 2020, November 2021, March 2022. I pulled my deployment records from the fireproof box I keep in my home office. I had kept comprehensive personal records across 26 years. The documentation jackpot does not arrive fully formed. It is built slowly by operational environments, where the absence of a record means an absence of accountability. I laid the deployment dates beside the modification timestamp clusters. Every peak extraction corresponded to a period of confirmed unreachability on my part. I looked at this for a long time, then I opened a second document, listed the amounts in sequence, added them: 8,400, 12,750 plus 300 plus 15,000 plus 6,200, 1,400 plus the rest. At the 48th line, the total read $287. I noted the LLC name in the investment advisory billing line. I ran a state business registry search. The primary filing showed a registered agent with no connection to anyone in my family. The secondary filing, an amendment submitted 6 weeks after registration, showed a different registered owner. Renee's maiden name, not hidden, just not expected to be found. I saved the export, named the new folder Trust Admin Review, closed the laptop, looked at my mother's mug sitting empty at the corner of the table, did not pick it up. Some realizations arrive quietly, not with the fury they deserve. With a cold, specific clarity that tells you the part of you that was still hoping has been replaced by something more useful. Not anger, not grief, purpose. I went to bed. In the morning I called a forensic accountant. Her name was Patricia Wren. A retired JAG attorney I had worked with briefly in 2018 referred her. Patricia specialized in financial exploitation cases, particularly estate fraud targeting military families. When I described what the timestamp clusters showed, she asked 3 questions. How many transactions, what time span, and whether a power of attorney was involved. I answered all 3. She said, "When can you bring the files?" We met 6 weeks later at her office. I brought the account export, the timestamp analysis I had built across 4 yellow legal pads, the deployment records with dates underlined in red, the original trust document from Harold Stearns's office, and every piece of correspondence I had with Davis's office, which was limited, because Davis had been careful about putting things in writing with me directly. Patricia looked at the timestamp comparisons for a long time without speaking. Then, "Someone was watching your schedule." "Yes," I said. "The POA execution during your father's hospitalization was filed within 72 hours of admission. That suggests preparation that preceded the hospitalization by weeks, possibly months. They were waiting for a qualifying event." "I know. The LLC billing structure." She indicated the printout. "This is not administrative overhead. There are no service contracts filed with the trust's administration. No deliverable documentation. Money left the trust and arrived in a private account through a company with no operational history. Under federal statute, this is wire fraud." She looked up. "You have everything you could document yourself. Everything accessible to me. I need you to verify what I couldn't reach." Patricia spent 11 weeks building the report. 89 pages. Every transaction traced to its destination. The LLC registration cross-referenced against Renee's business filings across 3 states. The modification timestamp clusters mapped against my documented absence periods. Davis's billing records compared against actual services rendered to the trust, with a $203,000 gap between invoiced amounts and documented services. She confirmed the total: 287,048 transfers. First transfer, February 14, 2020, 9:42 a.m. ST. They had waited until my aircraft was airborne. Then Patricia set one more printout on the desk. She placed it separate from the rest at the edge, the way you set something apart when you want the other person to notice it before you explain it. "There's something else," she said. "You should see this before we file." It was an email chain. Renee's address at the top, Davis's below. The thread ran from October 3rd through November 9th, 2021. My father had been hospitalized on November 18th, 2021. These emails predated the hospitalization by 6 weeks. They were written in careful professional language, the kind of careful that tells you the writer knows exactly what they're planning and is choosing their words with that awareness. Renee and Davis were discussing the conditions under which a durable power of attorney could be exercised over trust administrative decisions. The phrase qualifying event appeared 4 times. They discussed what constitutes sufficient incapacity documentation under Virginia probate law. They referenced my mother's trust by its specific filing number. They had not reacted to a hospitalization. They had been positioning for one, anyone, whenever it came. I looked at the date on the first email, October 3rd, 2021. My communications restricted assignment had begun September 28th. I had been unreachable for 6 weeks when they started writing the playbook. They had planned for my father to become incapacitated. They had simply been waiting for the moment to arrive. I set the printout back on Patricia's desk. "Add it to the file," I said. Patricia submitted the report to the civil court in November 2023. We filed a motion to freeze the LLC's remaining assets while probate fraud proceedings were initiated. The county attorney's office opened a formal inquiry the following week. None of this required me to tell anyone in my family what was coming. I did not tell them. I was waiting for the right moment, the same way they had waited for theirs. I had been preparing this folder for 14 months. December 23rd was its purpose. Margaret hosted Christmas dinner every December 23rd, a tradition she introduced the first year of the marriage, and that had calcified, over 8 years, into an event around which the extended family organized the entire month. 12 people at the table, poinsettias, the mulled cider in the crystal bowl, a toast that Margaret delivered with the comfortable authority of a woman who had never once been asked to justify her position at the head of the table. I accepted this year's invitation the same week the court froze the LLC's assets. I drove 3 hours from Virginia. I brought a green bean casserole made from my mother's recipe, in my mother's casserole dish. which Margaret had moved to a back cabinet during a kitchen reorganization in 2017, and which I had quietly relocated to my own home during a visit 2 years later. Margaret had never mentioned its absence. I am confident she never noticed it was gone. I arrived exactly on time. I helped carry dishes. I sat in my regular seat beside my father across from Renee, with a direct line of sight to Margaret at the head of the table. Renee was relaxed. The LLC had been generating income across 2023. She had mentioned in October a kitchen renovation she was planning. The same stainless steel appliances she had photographed in spring, now being upgraded to a full redesign, financed by money that the trust administrator had recorded as legal fees. She wore new earrings. She smiled at me when I sat down with the comfortable smile of someone who considers a risk managed. I smiled back. Dinner moved through its normal sequence. The green bean casserole was finished entirely, which my mother would have noted with quiet satisfaction. My father talked about his Navy history documentary series, with the enthusiasm of a man who finds comfort in things that remain consistent. He looked at me occasionally with an expression I had been seeing for months, an uncertain searching, as though he were trying to locate something he had misplaced and could not name. After the dessert plates were cleared, Margaret rose. "I want to say a few words." The room settled into the expected format. Several people reached for their glasses. "To family," Margaret began. Her voice was warm and practiced, the foundation of everything we. I placed the folder on the table. 89 pages. The weight of 14 months of preparation. The timestamp analysis, the transaction log, the LLC registration records, the cross-reference billing documentation. The navy blue cover faced up, the title visible. My mother's name on the second line. The total on the third. 287,000. The wine glass stayed in the air. Renee's hand moved toward her water glass and stopped. I opened to page 14. The timestamp cluster analysis, February 14, 2020. My flight departure at 6:15 a.m. The first modification timestamp at 9:42 a.m. The gap of 3 hours and 27 minutes between my aircraft lifting off and the first authorization paperwork being finalized. I turned the page to face Renee. "Tell me when this LLC was registered," I said. The room was completely still. The Christmas music continued playing. Someone's chair made a small sound against the hardwood floor. Renee looked at the page. She did not answer. "Page 41, I said. "The secondary registration. The filing error. Your maiden name." My father was looking at me now with an expression I had never seen on his face. Not the uncertain searching from dinner, but something stripped completely bare. A man encountering a version of his life he had not known existed. Margaret sat down slowly. The wine glass lowered. Her composure remained. It was, honestly, impressive. The control of someone who had spent years believing they would never need to account for any of this. "This is a misunderstanding," she said. One sentence, delivered in a steady voice, the most revealing thing she could have said. "Page 62, I said. Every billing record cross-referenced against documented services. Page 78. The original trust language my mother's attorney filed in 2009. And the amended version Davis filed in 2021. I looked at her steadily. "They are not the same document," a very specific silence. "The county attorney, 3 weeks, I said. Assets frozen, December 4th. Margaret looked at Renee. The first break in her composure all evening. An involuntary look, the look of an executor checking with her architect. It told me, in a single second, everything the 89 pages had already confirmed about who had designed this and who had carried it out. My father said something quietly at the end of the table. Just his own name. As though he's trying to reorient himself inside a room that had, in the space of 90 seconds, become entirely unfamiliar. I closed the folder. "I am not your account," I said. I looked at my father. Directly, without drama. "Dad," I said, "I think we need to talk." January 14th, 24. Davis surrendered his license to practice law. June 2024. Margaret and my father separated. August 2024, Margaret's attorney filed for contested divorce. October 2024, the contractor Renee had hired for the kitchen redesign filed a mechanic's lien against her property. The renovation was never completed. A for sale sign appeared in her front yard before Thanksgiving. December 2024, Renee's LLC formally dissolved. 2 active real estate transactions suspended pending compliance review. February 5th, 2025, civil settlement reached. Judgment entered $198. Zero in damages plus attorney fees against the $287,000 total stolen. The LLC's remaining $31,000 returned to the trust the same week. April 22nd, 2025. Renee's real estate license suspended pending investigation. Full recovery of the full $280 was not achieved. Patricia had prepared me for this. Civil fraud cases rarely recover dollar for dollar. What was recovered was the legal record, documented, permanent, and attached to every professional filing Davis and Renee would ever make for the rest of their careers. I am not the emergency account anymore. I am not the silent partner funding a family structure that would not function if I stopped being silent. I am not the daughter who kept quiet because no one was watching. Someone was always watching. I was. My father came to Virginia that summer. He sat across from me at the kitchen table where I had opened the account export at 1:23 in the morning and understood what had been done to my mother's estate while I was on an aircraft over Central Asia. He was smaller than I remembered, not in size, in the quality of how he held himself, as though the confidence he had carried for most of his life had turned out to be borrowed from a source he had not examined. "I didn't know," he said. I was quiet for a moment. "I believe you. I should have." "Yes," I said, "you should have." He looked at his hands then. "Your mother would have known in a week." "She would have known in a day," I said. We sat there for a long time. He asked about the dogs. I told him about the tomatoes. He noticed a loose hinge on the kitchen cabinet and fixed it without being asked, using tools from the box in my garage that he found without direction. An old movement, a memory in his hands. Before he left, he stood in the doorway of the kitchen. "I'm sorry, Diana." 3 words, no qualification, no explanation embedded inside to soften them. I nodded. I watched his car move down the gravel road until it reached the county road and was gone. Then I went inside. I poured coffee into my mother's Annapolis mug. I sat at the table in the morning light coming through the east window, which comes in clean and slow this time of year and turns everything it touches a particular shade of gold. I opened the yellow legal pad I keep beside the sugar bowl, turned to a clean page, wrote down the 3 things I needed to do that week, not because they were urgent, but because this is how I have always started mornings, and how my mother always started mornings, and some habits are not habits at all. They are inheritance. I still use yellow legal pads. Some things you keep because they work. Some things you keep because they're the clearest evidence of where you came from. Maybe you are the reliable one. Maybe you are the person in your family, or your workplace, or your community, or your circle of people who say they love you, who handles things quietly, who plans ahead, who documents carefully, who shows up every time without needing to be asked or reminded. Who has spent years being the person everyone turns to when something goes wrong, and the person everyone forgets about when something goes right. Maybe you have been told, in 100 different ways both explicit and unspoken, that your strength is an exemption from need, that because you cope well, you must not have much to cope with, that because you survive hard things, you must not find them hard, that your reliability is proof you don't require the same care you extend to others, freely, consistently, without keeping a visible tab. Maybe someone has been taking from you in ways that felt individually small enough to absorb, and then one day you added them up, and the number was not small at all. I want to speak directly to that. The people who take from capable, self-sufficient women are not always motivated by pure malice. Some are. But many operate from something quieter and in some ways more insidious. They simply do not believe you will look. Or they believe that even if you look, you will not act, because you never have before. Because your silence has become the most convincing evidence of permission they have ever been offered. This is the mechanism. This is what permitted $287,000 to leave my mother's trust over 4 years and arrive in a private account registered under a name they did not expect anyone to search. Not a sophisticated criminal operation, not an elaborate conspiracy, just the assumption, tested repeatedly and confirmed repeatedly, that the person most affected was too far away, too occupied, or simply too quiet to look closely enough. They built their confidence on that assumption. What they did not know was what my silence was made of. Here is what I believe beyond my particular story. There is a difference, a real one, worth stating plainly, between helping people through genuine hardship and funding the ongoing consequences of someone else's choices, because the alternative requires a confrontation you have been trained your whole life to avoid. The first is love. The second is a habit with an expensive price attached to it. Habits can be changed. The price accumulates regardless. The people who benefit most from your limits not existing will consistently be the loudest when you create them. This is not evidence that you were wrong to create them. It is evidence that they were necessary. Relationships that are healthy survive boundaries. Relationships that are not healthy treat boundaries as attacks on the relationship itself. There is a significant difference between these two responses, and you are allowed, fully, completely, without apology, to know which one you are looking at. Capable women are underestimated constantly by people who confuse discipline with passivity and patience with absence of observation. The woman who keeps her own counsel, who reads the fine print, who builds a file methodically while saying nothing about building it. She is not passive. She is operating on a longer timescale than the people counting on her inaction. They are counting on convenience. She is counting everything. If you are the reliable one, and I suspect, if you have watched this far, that some part of this is familiar, I want you to hear this clearly. Your reliability was never an invitation to take from you. Your competence was never a license. Your silence was never a legal agreement. The fact that you have been managing, compensating, absorbing, adjusting, for years, sometimes for decades, does not mean what was taken from you was not a crime. Sometimes it was documented across 89 pages. Sometimes the evidence is there, waiting to be assembled by the one person who knows what to look for. You are allowed to look. You are allowed to build the file. You are allowed to walk into the room where they believe they have already won and place the evidence on the tables and say, without elaboration, without raised voice, without triumph, here is what happened, and here is the proof. This is not revenge. Revenge requires heat and spectacle and an audience. What I placed on that table in December was not revenge. It was the formal record of a truth someone assumed I would never assemble. The distinction matters. Evidence does not require anger to be true. It does not require emotion to be effective. It requires only accuracy and the patience to compile it completely. You are allowed to compile it completely. My mother sat at that kitchen table every Tuesday morning. Coffee in the Annapolis mug, yellow legal pad, numbers moving from column to column in her careful handwriting while the house was still quiet around her. She was not building a fortress. She was simply keeping an accurate record of what was real. She taught me that without a single lesson, just by being the kind of woman who sat down, opened the pad and looked at what the numbers actually said. I sit at the same table now. The mug is the same. The legal pad is the same. The light through the east window is the same. What is different is that I know now exactly what I inherited. Not the money. Money can be stolen, and some of it was. What I inherited was the habit of looking, the discipline of counting, the understanding that the truth does not protect itself. Someone has to be willing to write it down. That is what the silent partner understands. If this story meant something to you today, I hope you will share it with someone who might need this reminder. Being strong does not make you safe from people who confuse strength with compliance. Being careful does, and you are allowed to be both, methodical, patient, precise, and then decisive, on your own timeline, with your own evidence, in a way that requires no explanation, because the documentation speaks without your help. The receipts matter. Keep them. If you believe that quiet strength still matters in this world, I hope you'll stay with us. New stories premiere every day.